trying to say religion is in the eye of the beholder is how it's perceived?
Yes.
Oh, that's what Jesse's going to talk about for the next couple of weeks.
Yes. Religion is in the eye of the tea holder, I guess. I give myself a slow golf clap there. All right. Okay. So I'm just going to spend a little bit introducing the topic, and then hint, today we're going to look at Methodism, which, by the way, if all things were perfect, I would have my colleague Heather Riggs teaching this class, but her live worship is at the same time as this class, so that won't work out. But maybe in the future I could bring her in to talk about Methodism. That would actually be fun at some point, is at least to get my local colleagues to represent their denomination from their perspective rather than from the subjective one. Okay.
Real quick on that, and then I'll shut up. I taught high school. I taught high school, Sunday school for many years, and for a year or two, we were taking a bus to various Christian churches in town, the Catholic, the Greek Orthodox, and I would talk to the priest, the pastor beforehand, and say, I'd like to bring some high school students. And then the following week, we would discuss in class what was common, not the differences. I didn't want to get into differences, but I want, and they were really enjoying it. But to be honest, observation, not a value judgment. I got a lot of pushback from some people in the congregations. Saying so. Anyway, I think we all had fun.
Good. Well, this is the interesting thing about looking at other denominations and, by extension, other religions, is people can see it as a critique maybe of their own faith, or an opportunity to critique, which is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit here. But yeah, great.
But it was more what was in common.
That's kind of the hope of this.
Yeah, not nitpicking on.
Yeah, and it's tough. I mean, everything is a critique of everything else, so there's that.
I mean, infant baptism just isn't going to go.
Fair enough. All right, so our topic of study for the next X+1 weeks. Never mind, it's a math joke. In other words, it's actually more like X+5, because I could tell you it's going to last this number of weeks, but in reality, it'll probably last 5 more than I actually anticipate. But anyways, so the topic is what I'm referring to as, or I don't even remember what I called it, Christian comparative Christianity. That's what I called it. When I was in seminary, I had to take a class called Comparative Religion, which is ecumenical. So it's looking at the world religions in light of your own. I want to look at specifically denominationalism in light of our own Lutheranism, quote unquote. Question, Jill.
Patrick Otuma, which you borrow from quite a bit, uses the phrase Christianities.
Yes.
And I always liked that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. Because that is a much more accurate representation. I mean, because like the contrasting term would be Christendom, right? This idea of all that's contained within Christianity, when in reality, especially in the modern era, the spectrum of diversity within Christianity is huge. I mean, just within the Americas, if you were to contrast, for example, like United Church of Christ with, I don't know, pick your hardcore fundamentalist. Well, even, we could say, without getting that direction, like an Amish or a conservative Amish or Mennonite tradition, right? That's way different stuff, although not necessarily pause myself before I go off on a tangent. So we're going to do comparative Christianity. So the roadmap that I've kind of laid out in my head is concentric circles. So we're going to start with some key mainline Protestant traditions, stuff that we're familiar with and isn't too far from our experience. But then the idea is to branch out and out and out and out. I am undecided as to whether or not I want to spend time on Catholicism, mainly because when you talk Catholicism, it's like what era,
Mm.
what part of the world, Catholicism is this huge thing. So I don't know, we'll see if we get there or not. But where I want to end up is some of the quote unquote, well, the path that I want to chart is going to go through maybe some denominationalism that we're not completely familiar with, like the Moravian Church, which we're in full communion with as Lutherans, and not the Navigators. I was trying to think of this last. Anyways, I want to.
Nazarene? No.
Well, Nazarene is going to be one of them for sure. Nazarene / Disciples of Christ in there somewhere too. But I want to chart a path through some of the denominations that we might not interact with regularly, but are not too dissimilar from us. But I want to end up at what would be more fringe, aka and fringe from our perspective. But Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, even maybe going into some of what we would refer to as more fundamentalist traditions. And I have two disclaimers. Maybe two, maybe one, maybe it's the same disclaimer. This is intended to be comparative, but not apologetic. So in other words, we're going to look at the faith practices, the theology, the structure of these denominations, but it's not intended to be a critique from the perspective of Lutheranism. So in other words, this isn't a talk on why we're right and everybody else is wrong. It's intended to be an open conversation around, what's the history of these denominations? What do their practices and beliefs look like, in the Common Era, and an opportunity to kind of say, from our perspective, how does that look? But what value might that have, or what does that different perspective contribute to as Jill, you referred to, the Christianities of the modern era. So that's my kind of like blanket disclaimer. I'm not approaching this from the unfortunate way that I was taught it in seminary, which was, here's why Lutherans are right and everybody else is going to hell. No, that wasn't actually what they said, but why everybody else is wrong. But rather, it's an objective / subjective look at these different faith traditions. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Not that you not that we can't offer critiques and stuff like that, but that's my approach. Voila. Okay, so today's topic of conversation is Methodism. First question: have any of you all had an experience of Methodism, aka, or not just do you know any Methodists, but have you ever worshiped in a Methodist church, or do you have any Methodist roots in your background?
Roots.
Can you say a little bit about that, Susan?
My mother's family in St. Louis were Methodists. And then I have, going farther back, an ancestor who was a Methodist minister in Virginia at a time when Church of England was the only allowed Christian representative.
Wow. Like, so original.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool. And that's
1700.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, that actually plays a huge part of the story of Methodism is the contrast with the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the roots of Methodism are essentially kind of like a second wave of Puritanism, kind of, but it goes in a subtly different direction. But it's fascinating. We'll get to that.
In the book, A River Runs Through It.
I
think a comment is made that Methodists are like Baptists who can read or something.
You can Google that to confirm that.
Loving Christian family.
What'd you say, Andy?
A loving Christian family.
A loving. I haven't seen that movie in a long time. I'll have to check out that quote. That's a great.
My Finnish mother was raised Methodist, but my Norwegian father was raised Lutheran, so we were all raised Lutheran.
Wow.
So I got some insight from my mother, but not that much.
Oh, Susan, go for it.
Yeah, when I went to Burundi with Medical Teams International, actually it was pretty much solo, and the people that were involved were Free Methodists, and I found them to be an extremely conservative, rigid branch of Methodists.
Yeah, they're holiness movement folks. Yeah, that's it. Well, and one of the things with any of the denominations that we're speaking of is when you take a look at it, especially from kind of like an objective standpoint, you're looking really at the center of it. In reality, any denomination that you speak of is going to have the spectrum, although some denominations, obviously that spectrum is going to be more limited. But like, the United Methodist Church or the ELCA, we can be talking of quite a broad spectrum, but as you get to more of the extremes, you'll end up with maybe a narrow piece. But yeah, so like, again, if I'm speaking of different denominations, I'm not going to be representing the full breadth of their experience. That's my third disclaimer. Anybody else with Methodist experience?
Well, I have been interested in exposure. I think my initial exposure was through a personal connection. I wound up being the director of a work camp in the Carolinas, doing volunteer work in the Black Bottoms, poverty-stricken, extreme poverty. And we were doing rich, affluent kids from Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. would come down and do a week or two of volunteer labor, basic repairs, that type of thing. The interesting thing was the church that hosted us had an intern minister there that year. And I will say he was a dead ringer for a Jesse type person. It kind of blew my mind away that a mainline Christian church would have someone that he thought Kung Fu was a Christ figure.
That's a hoot. Oh, that's great. Matt.
Haven't the Methodists had a big kind of a split in their church over ordaining, I don't know if it's homosexual people or married people or something?
Yeah. So 2017, I want to say. Yeah, I think it was 2017 or maybe 2018. So every year, similar to the ELCA, the or is it every year? It might be every other year. They can convene what's called the General Assembly. I think that terminology is correct. So they have, but it's every other year, I'm pretty sure, because so you have to keep in mind that the United Methodist Church is an international denomination, as contrasted with like the ELCA, which is a national denomination. So they convene this General Assembly where, again, similar to the ELCA's church-wide gathering that happens, things are brought to the floor. And of course, one of the things that has been center to pretty much all American denominations over the past 2 decades has been the question of ordaining openly gay, and lesbian folks. Well, the ELCA answers all their problems by social statements, which are they're not regulatory. In other words, it's a social statement, as we've talked about before, is a sampling of the beliefs within the ELCA with some guidance expressed by those who craft the social statement, right? So if you look at the social statement on human sexuality that the ELCA drafted back in 2009 or affirmed back in 2009, it was a shift because it gave permission for the ordination of openly gay and lesbian folks, well, LGBTQIA plus folks, but didn't say, you have to do this or have to do that. The struggle within the UMC, especially, and this really has nothing to do with its international nature, but because of the way that their polity works, everything is regulatory. So if you, for example, currently they still have not resolved this issue. If you currently marry somebody, if you perform a marriage on somebody who is non-heterosexual, sorry, bad choice of words. If you perform a wedding between a non-heterosexual couple, you will be punished by your church body.
That has to be cisgender heterosexual.
Yes, cisgender heterosexual. Thank you, Susan. So, but the way that's currently functioning right now, because the Methodist UMC is currently kind of in limbo, for lack of a better word. I'll have to check with Heather on where they're at on this, is that there's basically a 50-50 split. Well, it's a little bit more majority pro LGBTQIA plus in the international organization, between people that are pro versus people that are against it. And what that means is that it currently hasn't passed, right? They didn't currently relax those rules or grant the ability, but the Western portion of the UMC, because they're broken into districts as well too, kind of similar to our synods or our regions, is currently refusing to apply the punishment for ordaining and or doing same-sex marriages, which means they're technically still in violation. And for example, my colleague Heather did perform a marriage for a same-sex couple. She was reported, I can't remember there's a technical terminology for it. She was reported to her denomination, but the denomination at this time is currently refusing to apply the penalties, which could involve having your salary taken away from you, because that has to do with the structure of the Methodist Church as well too, which we'll all get to later on. But yes, Matt, you are absolutely correct, and they still haven't figured out what road they're going to go yet. What we were hearing back in 2018 was that the UMC was going to split between its more conservative elements and its more centrist / progressive elements. That hasn't happened as far as I know. There was money that was being, well, that would be a much longer conversation. But
well, they had their international conference here a few years ago. Here in Portland.
Yep.
And it was during the time that Linda and I lived in the apartment down by the Lloyd Center, and it was pretty interesting because all of the meetings and such were over at the convention center. But a lot of the delegates were staying at the Doubletree, which was next door to our apartment complex.
Huh.
And they had a lot of people from, foreign countries. And,
yes.
They were well-dressed, prosperous-looking people.
Yes.
But it was kind of cool. It was kind of like being in Europe somewhere where, you have people from all over the world and.
Well, and that's the other piece of this equation, is that because they're an international organization, right now a major source of the conflict is that the Methodism that is in post-colonial Africa is generally, similar to Lutheranism, more socially conservative. And I say generally, and that's kind of the conflict, is that, and to be fair, there are extremely conservative churches in the Americas, in the U.S. that are in the part of the United Methodist Church, and right now it's kind of split. They refer to themselves as the Wesleyan congregations. That makes, of course, they're claiming the Wesleyan orthodoxy as their foothold.
That's one in Wesley.
Yeah.
Oh.
All right, I'm gonna do a really quick. Or Marlena, go for it. You're muted, by the way.
There's a Methodist church on Linwood Road, not far from here.
St.
And
Paul.
after that ruling by the Methodist headquarters, they had a sign on their reader board stating that they weren't part of that everyone was welcome there.
Well, Oak Grove UMC put up a giant rainbow flag the day that decision came through. So yeah, and no surprise, the UMC churches in and around the Portland metropolitan area would be, extremely progressive relative to most others. So like First Congregational or First United Methodist, which is it's not down, it's over by where I used to live. They're also, extremely progressive. So Heather would provide an interesting perspective on that, because I'm sure there are conservative examples within this area as well too. So, okay, I'm gonna do a really quick slap bang history of the Methodist tradition, because then I want to the meat of the rest of our time I want to spend just kind of talking about the core theological pieces of Methodism. Give us a chance to kind of look at them and and compare contrast with our So Methodism founded-ish by a guy named John Wesley, hence the Wesleyan theology, Wesleyan University, et cetera, et cetera. Two other figures that were heavily involved were his brother Charles Wesley and a guy named George Whitefield. Have you heard these names? That sound familiar at all?
Yep.
Okay. So these are the three big movers and shakers. What's interesting is it basically starts out as a university group. So they all went to Cambridge, and they all during their time there decided that they were going to live holy lives, which is a subjective thing. And in this case, what that meant for them was that they wanted to be, I mean, it sounds very self-improvement. They wanted to be the best versions of themselves that they possibly could. And so what that meant concretely was that for the most part, they forewent the practice of imbibing alcohol. They did fasting. They took Eucharist at least once a week. That was a major part of their practice. Anything else I want to mention there? And also forewent any forms of luxury or most forms of amusement. So one of the things that this eventually feeds into is early Methodism. I make jokes about no dancing, no having fun. That was kind of the piece of early Methodism, was that they felt that the perfection of your life, and this is a part of the theology here, was done through these basically three spiritual practices, which I'll get into in a bit.
What time was this, Jesse?
This is early 18th century, and it was Oxford, not Cambridge. I don't want to make any people roll over in their grave. I misspoke. It's Oxford, not Cambridge. I'm sure that is a rivalry within the UK education system. So yeah, these it was more than just the three, but there was a small group of young men who were setting about to live a holy life, and this is how they did it. One of the other pieces that was part of their practice was they felt called to visit the sick and the poor and prisoners. They felt that one of the roles of any person who was living a holy life was to do these works of charity and to reach out to those who were, quote unquote, disenfranchised, or as we would say in a modern era, on the margins. And this is core to one of their things, is because they really felt that there was no life that was unredeemable and unperfectible through the Holy Spirit. So that's interesting. 1735, to give you a concrete date, this group of young men were invited by the founder of the Georgia colony, a guy named James Oglethorpe. Do you recognize that name, Joe? Okay. They were invited to come and minister to the Native Americans that were in the Georgia colony.
By the way, Oglethorpe is actually a really big guy.
Is he?
Yeah. And so people are like, they're really bummed out with the statuary of him, because they're like, look at how they're making him out to be this giant. No, he's actually a big guy.
He was a huge dude. That's great. I don't know much about the history of the Georgia colony, so that's fascinating. So they get invited to go over there. They spend a couple of years there, but are widely unsuccessful in converting the natives to Christianity. And they return to the UK basically just totally demoralized and thinking they had this divine calling. Nothing really happened out of it. Big bummer. So what follows is essentially the quote unquote conversion experience of John Wesley and his brother Charles, and then Whitefield, where they were sitting in a worship service, and they were actually participating in the Moravian Church at this time. That was where they found their faith. And Wesley has this experience that he describes as having his heart strangely warmed. And you're going to find this language throughout kind of the Methodist conversation. And he in his journal wrote, "I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance, underline assurance, ASS, not IS, was given to me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." And his brother Charles had a similar experience a few days earlier. And so out of this experience, they are rejuvenated, and this becomes the foundation for what eventually becomes Methodism. So the Wesley brothers begin extemporaneous preaching. They are preaching outdoors, in fields, in houses, in religious societies. They're basically making the tour, preaching based on this experience of having their hearts strangely warmed. And one of the pieces here is that they are also simultaneously rejecting Calvinism, which in the fabric of religiosity in the UK during this time, you essentially have the established church, capital E, which we would refer to as the Episcopal / Anglican Church, and Presbyterianism, right? If you remember our study on Scotland, Presbyterianism, which is Calvinist in origin, those are the two major, elements that make up the fabric of religious life. Episcopalianism, obviously not Calvinist in nature. Again, Episcopalianism, more Catholic-ish, very high church. It's hard to describe in short terms. But anyways, so one of the early things that marked John and Charles was that they rejected Calvinism. Whitefield fully embraced Calvinism. And the core teaching here that this means is predestination with regards to salvation. So it's this idea within Calvinism that God has preordained the elect, all those that God's going to save, God picked ahead of time. Now it's just up to everything to play out. The Wesleys rejected this, which led to some interesting conflict between the Wesleys and Whitefield, but surprisingly didn't fracture their relationship. They all three kind of stick together throughout this process. Along the way, they recruit other folks that become a part of their movement. A guy named Howell Harris, the Countess of Huntington, a woman named Selina Hastings, all kind of become attached to this. Then Whitefield himself returns to Georgia, and the Wesleys return to Georgia. Whitefield follows, and the reason being is because they had started kind of forming. This movement was taking off, but it met, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, a lot of resistance. In fact, there was a lot of straight up slander that was spoken against the Methodists. So there was one guy a guy named William Hogarth, who did this cartoon editorial piece in the paper, in the news, and it was entitled "Credulity, Superstition, and Fanaticism." And it was a cartoon depicting this ecstatic worship experience, essentially, critiquing the Methodists, saying, they're all about extemporaneous emotionalism, and not one whit of rationality is present in their theology, which is really hilarious because the root of the name Methodist comes from the extreme methodical nature by which they wanted to practice their faith. And even the word Methodist was originally a critique spoken against them, which John Wesley in turn embraces fully and then utilizes in his description of their religious movement. And so the core of what Methodism is at the beginning is this idea that you as a human being are gifted, and this is language that we use in Lutheranism, gifted with faith, with grace by the divine. But one of the key pieces, and maybe this is a departure from our Lutheran tradition, is that Wesley advocates that every person of faith has this moment of a new birth. So for him, it was this strange warming of his heart where he was, the recreation begins inside. The Holy Spirit, he would say, takes root within him. And then what the life of a disciple or the life of a Christian is operating out of this moment of new birth and perfecting that. And the way that you perfect that is through, quote unquote, the method, which is doing these personal spiritual practices that they advocated. Again, it's giving up or setting aside luxury and personal amusement and stuff like that, practicing fasting, taking the Eucharist, but also doing these works of piety, which is caring for and ministering to those less fortunate. And not just less, I mean, it's not just less fortunate, but ministering to everybody, regardless of your social or economic station, which, as you might imagine, in Victorian England, did not go over super well because classism and hierarchy was very core to that society. And so they, in many ways, were essentially advocating a cultural socialism. There is no hierarchy. God especially is calling you to preach into the hearts of those, and this fits along then also what they're calling to be missionaries to native peoples, etc. Everybody is being called to herd, and of course, well, I'm not going to get into that right now. Never mind. I'm just about to wrap this up here. Okay, so what ends up happening though is that the Methodist Church it begins to develop, especially post the death of John Wesley, but doesn't ultimately at that point in time take root in the UK, and so they end up shifting over to the Americas. All three of the key people moved to the US, and then begin doing, I mean, because original Methodist preachers were quote unquote itinerant. And here was this essentially the big split where they eventually left the established church, because similar to any denominational movement, the original idea was to reform the Church of England, not to start a new denomination or not to start a new faith. The breaking point, which this is hilarious from a Lutheran perspective, was where John, Charles, and George felt called to empower lay ministers and eventually ordain them into the preaching of the gospel. And according to the Church of England, which this is one of the conflicts that occurs with it, was that only a bishop could ordain. And so they went to the Americas and just started, ordaining and empowering lay preachers, itinerant preachers, to travel around doing this work. And that was kind of the point at which they said, well, we have departed from that, departed from our origins.
Yes.
Go,
Can I
Jim.
ask a question? Because
Yeah,
I think
please.
we're shifting into theology here right now. Is there some sort of like militaristic background? Because there's like the Salvation Army. Is that
Different thing.
Methodist? Oh,
That's a good
okay,
question.
great.
We should look at the Salvation Army at some point.
I thought this was attached to Methodist, and if it's not, then that's great. It's an open question.
It could be, but if it is, it's obviously a post. Salvation Army origins are 1865. So that, 150 years post.
Okay.
Yeah. That, you know what? You've inspired me to look at the Salvation Army at some point. I'm going to write that down. That one wasn't on my list, but I think it should be. I could do parachurch organizations. So, and then what ends up happening is originally they moved to the US. I mentioned that Lady Huntington, Selena, she ends up founding the Free Church of England in England, but mainly Methodism at its origins is in the American colonies or British colonies in America. So never mind. I'm not going to get into that. And also one other key thing here that's important is that early Methodism was radical in that it promoted and allowed women authority in church leadership, which you can contrast with pretty much any other faith or Christian denomination in the American colonies in Britain at that time. Okay, Matt, go for it. Question.
Now there's an African American branch of the Methodist Church. Is that a separate organization or a spinoff or?
Yes. So, well, here's an important piece. So there are 15-ish Methodist denominations within North America. If you're talking worldwide, there are lots. And there are confusingly several that share the same name ish. So for example, there is an African Methodist church in Africa, and there is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, which is in North America.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. They're very prominent.
Yes. So AME churches are essentially one of the major Black denominations in the United States. Otis Moss the third. What's the name of that church? Trinity AME in Chicago is one of the most influential. Otis Moss the third is one of the most influential preachers in Black theology, and yeah, they're cool.
But they would be separate, like from Heather's church. I mean,
yes, completely different denomination. Yep. I'll have to, that would be an interesting question for Heather, is what are the inter-Methodist relations like? Do they congress with one another? But then even the Church of the Nazarene is a break off from Methodism as well too. So and we already mentioned Free Methodists. I mean, some of these names are great. There's the Primitive Methodist Church. I already mentioned the Wesleyan Church, Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. I mean, it's great. But the major Methodist, I would say the two major Methodist denominations in the U.S. are the AME and the UMC. Those are your big ones. I'll get clarification from Heather on that. Susan, yes.
Okay. What about the Moravian Church that you mentioned earlier?
That's a predecessor. So the Moravian is another Protestant. It's a Protestant denomination that comes out of a specific part of Europe. I haven't done my research on the Moravians yet, but I've often heard the Moravians as referred to as Lutheran tangent, in that our belief system is not all that dissimilar, but it more has to do with geographical origins. I don't know. I'll have more on the Moravians when I do my Moravian research. I could be contradicting myself at that point. So, but good question. But yeah, so the Wesleys were originally found a home in the Moravian Church. That was where they practiced, and then they kind of launched off. I don't know that they had any critique with the Moravians, but they were feeling called to do their own thing. So,
what's the membership of the United Methodist Church here in the U.S.?
In the U.S., good question. I have that pulled up. It's like 80 million worldwide or something like that. Oh, no, not 80 million. It's about 13 million worldwide. There's about 6.5 million in the US. So bigger than the ELCA, right? We are about 3.5 right now, I think. 3.5 million. So Methodism is, about double us. Any other questions before we move into theology? All right. So there are some key theological things that are core to Methodism. I already mentioned one of them, which is the idea of being born again. Now, important piece is the contrast between a Methodist concept of being born again versus potentially an evangelical perspective, right? So we're more familiar with the evangelical perspective, which is believer's baptism is kind of your born again moment. So within that tradition, somebody might make an altar call, and you who have lived a sinful life up to this point, I'm characterizing this, right? Feel called to change your life for the better, and so you go up, and the pastor might do a laying on of hands, and then you commit to your believer's baptism, which has to happen past the age of accountability. So after the age of 14, and then you're, now you're a Christian, quote unquote. The idea within Methodism is based more on not an Anabaptist perspective, but more on this experience that Wesley has of having his fire kindled within his heart. So it's this idea that at some point in your life, could happen early, could happen later in life, you are implanted with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit encourages you on your journey of perfecting your salvation. Now, again, this would be a really great question for Heather, because I don't think it's that formalized. I think that I suspect that theology has more become a way of understanding your faith as opposed to an actual step that you take in life. Mainly, and I'm basing this off of language that I've heard Heather use before, with regards to how it's kind of, how we talk about within Lutheran theology, the idea of our baptism, being reminded of our baptism every day. I think it's kind of a similar thing within Methodism, that your heart is being kindled to acts of charity, etc. But I could be misrepresenting it. Anyhow, so that's a core piece. But here's where we do get some divergence among, like, for example, Methodism and Lutheranism, is then Wesley talked about two ideas. One is the idea of assurance, which I mentioned, underline ASS. It's the idea that every person, especially the people who have experienced this rebirth experience, they having their heart kindled within them, experiences an assurance of God's forgiving love. Okay. So it's the idea that once your heart has been kindled within you, you in every moment of every day know that God is loving you and that you are on the right path. Because again, within the Methodist practice, living the method and walking this right path, and this is my language here, I'm paraphrasing significantly here, is an important part of it. And so Methodists have two concepts of righteousness, imparted and imputed righteousness. So imputed righteousness is the righteousness that Jesus gives you. And within Lutheranism, we might refer to this as the gift of faith, which we receive from God. But imparted righteousness is the righteousness that you get at the moment of your new birth. And it's this imparted righteousness that is the method in which you exercise this, or you walk this path of what Wesley referred to as Christian perfection, which is by following the method, by practicing prayer, fasting, and the meal, and then works of charity, that you slowly over the course of your lifetime perfect your Christianity, right? So it's a work in progress, with the idea that you get closer and closer to Christian perfection, whatever that looks like. Okay. And then, I mentioned the works of piety are the way that you do this. In Wesley's understanding, works of piety are these spiritual disciplines that serve as a means of grace, right? So it's not just about perfecting yourself. It's also a way in which you experience this imparted righteousness. But it's also the way in which you become more holy, essentially. There's also the concept of works of mercy, which go along the works of piety, which are kind of a subcategory of specifically helping those in need. So it's a distinction between like prayer and practicing the meal, but it's works of charity. One final thing, and then we can have some conversation, is one of the cool things within the Methodist tradition. Have you guys heard of love feasts before? Is that a Mel? You're nodding your head. Jill, no.
It sounds like a 60s term.
1860 or 1760.
Oh, 17, not okay.
Yeah. So
The summer of love.
Yeah. So this was one of the things that was core to the Wesleyan practice, which it was communion, but amplified. And John Wesley felt like this is one of the key ways in which you experience the love of God, which is why they called it a love feast, which was that you would have a gathering with people which centered around the meal. There may be preaching, but the core part of it was, getting together. And again, they're teetotalers for the most part. So what would happen is you would get there, you would say some prayers, there'd be a grace said, like you're sitting down to a meal, and then they would distribute the bread. After the bread is distributed, then they make a collection for the poor, again, acts of mercy. And then they would circulate what's called the loving cup, which was filled with water, because again, teetotalers, and everyone would drink from the loving cup. And then they would close. There might be a short address by the minister, not usually a full sermon. And then people would make testimony. And this was another key piece of the love feast, which was people would talk about the way that they had experienced God in their life. This is one of the key pieces. And for example, the AME church and within the Black Methodist Church is making testimony as a key part of your faith experience. And I was witness to it. I went to an AME church, as part of my seminary education. I had to visit different denominations. There's literally a part of their service where they stand up and they pass the mic around and people talk about the way that they've experienced God over the course of their week. So this was, love feast. Still a major part of practice within the USC. Pastor Heather, Oak Grove has had love feasts before. If you are part of a UMC, outdoor camp, they regularly have love feasts as part of the camp experience. I think this is pretty cool. I thought it's pretty neat. I think that's a great idea, but it centers around the meal. Okay, sorry, it's already 10:57. Are you okay sticking around maybe 5-10 minutes past? Okay. Out of these theological things, is there anything that you see that's, I kind of led us in a certain direction, but anything that you find curious, interesting, or contrasts with your theology, etc.? Let me put it a different way. What do you think about the idea of perfecting your Christianity?
It sounds like work. The works issue. Yeah.
It does, right? This is the thing that right off the bat is going to, rubs Lutherans the wrong way, is we are like me and spiders with anything regarding, the word works righteousness, put work and righteousness in the same sentence. And Luther's got something bad to say about it. Jill.
They have something called the 4 pillars.
Yes. So that's I didn't. What's that?
Can we do that next week or something? I don't understand that, and I feel like there's something very comparatively useful with regard to the Lutherans on that, and that's where I have a huge question mark.
So keep in mind the 4 pillars is something that comes about post John Wesley.
Oh, so I'm doing something whole different. All right.
No, you're not. No, it's a part of Methodism. It was based on Wesley's stuff, but it's often referred to as the Methodist Quadrilateral.
Yeah.
I love that term, but it's the idea that that's not about practice. That's about where you it's about influence. So the 4 sources of faith are scripture, tradition, reason, and Christian experience. So the Methodist Quadrilateral is really emphasizing this idea that scripture, yes, is a primary source, but the other ways in which we hear from God are tradition, reason, and experience, which fits in with this idea of Christian perfectionism or perfection of Christianity, whatever, which is that as you become more, as you practice the methods, right, you become more in tune with the voice of God.
Okay. So that's kind of what we're talking about, that 4th pillar that we don't hold.
Yes. I can't remember the name of the guy who Albert Outler.
Marlena, you're muted. There you go.
Well, I think of perfecting our life, get to a perfect Christian, whatever. I don't think of that necessarily as works. I'm more like, being kind and helpful and making someone feel better. Like when it's all over, when it's all said and done, have we made anybody's life better? More than works. And so is Methodism just about works, or is it about just kindness and thoughtfulness and respectfulness?
Yeah. And then, and here's the thing. Never mind. I'll come back to that. Yeah, I'm in accord with you on this. What else? Who else? What do you think of this? What about this new birth idea? Yeah.
I've heard the term, and I often reflect, that Billy Graham in Los Angeles in the Coliseum with 10 million people, where he had a call and I went up. Was that my birth? was that my teen birth experience. I do remember it.
Well, I was raised in a church where it was so terribly important. I remember my father, the first thing he would hit another Christian up with, have you been born again? That was so incredibly important. That was the major dividing point.
Yeah.
This morning, listening to the I didn't realize the Methodists even held something like that, but that there is a much kinder, gentler version of that.
Yeah.
And I was really, it's allowed me to rehabilitate that concept more, something that I can find more acceptable. My original being born again has never been satisfactory.
Yes. Well, and I'm biased because of my primarily Lutheran upbringing, but yeah, I'm terrified of the whole born again concept. My dad has some famous experiences where he's had, well, either some proselytes come to his door and ask him about his theology, and he's taken great joy in debating the born again experience with them. But sorry, April, or sorry, Paula, you were going to say something.
I'm the born again concept has always kind of taken me aback because I'm not any firsthand knowledge of it being born a Lutheran, but I've been to a fundamentalist church. I don't know. I think it was Church of Christ, where there was the total immersion baptism and the showing of, I think they were speaking in tongues and all that. Horrifying. Horrifying. I was scared to death.
Well, it brings up the point. It brings up the point. How many times can you be born again?
Precisely.
What's the relevance of it if you can do it over and over and over again? I mean, what's the relevance?
Well, and I think here, this is the thing, is I think this is maybe one place where Wesley and a more Baptist, Anabaptist experience would be in accord, is that in Wesley's experience, it's, if we're sticking to John Wesley and his core, is that it's something that happens in your life. Again, the difference here is that it's not linked with a rebaptism experience, but this idea that, at some point in your life, the Holy Spirit kindles within you and then calls you forth. And that, by the way, was what Methodist preaching was all about, was they felt that they were called to go to everybody and try to kindle that experience with them, in them, the thing that I appreciated about it is it wasn't about a turn or burn. It was about helping people realize, because what Wesley felt kindled within him was not an awareness of his own sinfulness. It was an awareness of the love of God. And so that was what they felt that they were communicating to people. But I think, and again, I might be misrepresenting here. For him, I think it's a one-time thing. I think in the modern UMC experience, it's more along what we refer to as an acknowledgement of our own baptism, on a daily basis.
What does the Bible say?
That's the eternal question. As I always tell people, the Bible doesn't say anything. An author within the Bible might have something to say about it.
Oh, yes, that's true.
But like this is basically Paul. Well, no, it's not just Paul. It's Gospel of John. This is John 14 with Nicodemus. Where Nicodemus comes to Jesus and Jesus tells him, "You must be born again. You must be born from above." This is the quoted verse when it comes to this born again experience.
And your sermon was amazing the last time you gave it on that particular passage. So props to you.
You can tell me that anytime you want. Jim, what were you going to say?
Oh, I as far as the born again and the works or whatever, and as far as the Methodism to understand that you are blessed, I understand my works of my quote unquote works are out of gratitude for that and not to earn something.
This is
sort of my spin on that whole.
This is the divergence point for me as well too. Is I'm uncomfortable with the idea of a consistent linear, progression. This idea that at some point in my life, I'm reborn, whether that's at my moment of birth or whether it's at a later point in my life, and that everything up there has to be an uphill, that I participate in this process of perfection, which needs to have a positive slope to it. That makes me uncomfortable. And to be fair, this is probably out of my Lutheran upbringing and my training in Lutheran theology. I would say the one piece of Lutheran theology that flies in direct conflict is the concept of simultaneously sinner and saint, which is something that Luther advocates. And if you really wanted to get like orthodox, if you really wanted to be a jerk about it, you could say that our concept of remembering our baptism daily flies in direct conflict of that, because one of the things that Luther hits on is that every day I die to my old self and rise, indicating that I didn't make any progression. It's every day I hit the reset button and hope for the grace of God.
Groundhog Day.
That is important to me, because if I were to chart the line of my spiritual perfection, it looks like a sine wave. At least for maybe it's a trending slope upwards. Susan.
When we were going to be married, we considered having the wedding in Shasta, Lake Shasta, where Jim's family had friends and network. And the family friend said, well, this pastor will marry you if you accept Jesus as your personal savior. And I couldn't even comprehend what those words meant,
That is,
we weren't married there.
Yeah, obviously. And that's all. I mean, obviously that's something I'm wholeheartedly opposed to, because that's just obvious gatekeeping. That has nothing to do with, because I was like, here's the question that I always want to ask, right? So what you're basically asking me in that situation is to parrot the words that you want me to say to you. And you have no way to possibly know whether or not those words are genuine. Did anything spiritual happen within me? No, no, you're just telling me to say something to fall in line with you. I mean, that's just a power play. That has nothing to do with, anyways, allow me to rant on that further. I would say the one thing, I've kind of advocated why I'm uncomfortable with this idea of perfection, but the one thing I would critique of Lutheranism, which when we get super works righteousness heavy or critiquing, is that it's very hard within our tradition to find a justification for why we should be inspired to practice works of grace and mercy. I mean, and you can see it within Lutheran orthodoxy, where it's like, well, and Luther spoke against this. Actually, he referred to it as passive righteousness. No, that wasn't it. Anyways, he had a critique of people who said, well, I'm saved by God, I don't need to do anything, and he kind of pulled a fast one on him and said, well, then that's evidence that you haven't actually been saved in your sinfulness. But I think that is one possibility within Lutheranism, is that we get so focused on our antipathy towards this idea of works righteousness that sometimes we have a hard time articulating the importance of doing, of caring for the poor, caring for the disenfranchised, of even practicing personal piety and spirituality, not because it earns us our place in heaven, but because it's an important part of our spirituality, right? Which is one of the pieces I absolutely appreciate about the idea of having a method, right? Right. I mean, when you train for a marathon, or when you train for, an ultra marathon, like, your son does, or when you do any of this stuff, you can't, obviously you're trying to achieve a goal, but in a lot of ways it's the process, which is important. It's not the goal that is the end result. It's the process of doing this work, which ultimately.
Right. So it really begs the point of, is the process the appointed way of salvation?
It's the journey, not.
And so out of that faith comes these works of gratitude.
Yeah, absolutely. And even Wesley would say that it's through practicing the method that you experience God. It's not just about reaching a state of perfection. It's about you by doing the method, you experience the divine love. Your heart is kindled within you. Which, that's Lutheran.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're trying to write how do I recognize and experience my situatedness in this participation. Fair enough. If you're using this to make proof within your own body that God's promises are correct, I think you're just asking for trouble right there.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
You could also ask a theological, well, just a mental question would be, can an atheist practice the method and feel he's contributing in a good way to society? And I mean, why couldn't he? I mean, what's
Yeah,
the difference?
Yeah, you want to make an orthodox, ultra orthodox squirm. This is the question, right? Well, even Luther, he's got that famous quote, I would rather be governed by and again, this is probably considered racist language, but a wise Moor than a foolish Christian, right? So he was arguing that he would, again, he shifts his perspective later in life because he gets grumpy and racist. But he had this famous statement, which was this idea that ultimately the kingdom of God is better advanced by somebody who has a different belief system, but governs wisely, than by somebody who, quote unquote, is Christian but is a poor administrator.
And even the current Pope has said that.
I know, he's quote, yeah. Well, and he's specifically with regards to atheism,
Yes.
Yeah.
So one more factoid about my ancestor is that he and another Methodist or Baptist preacher met with James Madison, who had a doctorate in divinity. And out of that conversation, the idea of not establishing a state religion got inserted into the Constitution.
Susan, your family is like, revolutionary famous.
I'm also related to Judge Lynch, for whom lynching was named.
Simul Justus et peccator. That's exactly what I was going to say.
A variety.
Oh, that's great.
But he was against lynching, actually, I'm told.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, it's 11:15. My wife is going to kill me if we go much more longer, so I should probably wrap this up. So next week I want to look at Presbyterianism, okay. and that might round out kind of our mainline look. Well, never mind. Ignore everything I'm saying, but we're going to look at Presbyterianism next week. And then one more thing I wanted to say is that in each of these successive conversations, I'm intending this to be a plural conversation. So if you've got stuff about Methodism that you want to bring forward into next week, please do so. Because I think what will be more fascinating is seeing having all these in conversation with each other, as opposed to it just being like a Lutheran Methodist or Lutheran Presbyterian dichotomy. So
I want to make one quick comment, just to stake my claim in the earth here. My father's middle name was Wesley. My middle name is Wesley.
And your
son's middle name is Wesley. And our grandson's first name is Wesley.
You're closet Methodists.
Yeah.
I knew there were some. Hey, good to see everybody today. Thanks for being here. Looking forward to this conversation for next week, and enjoy the sunshine while it lasts.
Thank you all.
Thanks.